In the early hours of a hot, oppressive summer night, an unexpected discovery is made deep within the National Archives of Washington, D.C. The document, seemingly forgotten by time, had been buried under countless other records, its significance overlooked for more than a century. The letter, yellowed and fragile, is addressed to a former president of the United States. But its contents are far from ordinary. In carefully written words, an unnamed woman reveals an unspeakable truth. 6 children were born from the president's wife's enslaved sister, all fathered by the president himself. The revelation is a shock to those who uncover it, but it is a truth that has been hidden for generations. How could such a horrifying secret have been kept so well guarded, and why did no one speak of it until now? The letter paints a chilling picture of a powerful man whose public image was one of virtuous leadership, while in private, he was enmeshed in a deep, personal betrayal that could tear apart the very fabric of his legacy. The discovery sends shockwaves through those who study history, particularly the complex and often dark legacy of American presidents. This is a tale that's not just about the immoral acts of a man in power, but also about the broader system of slavery, exploitation, and the suffering of those whose voices were never heard. It's a story that begs for answers, not only to the questions surrounding the president's actions but also about the lives of the children whose very existence have been erased from history. The documentary begins with the chilling discovery of the letter, providing the audience with an emotional and haunting hook. The viewer is thrust into the mystery immediately, compelled to question how something so profound could be kept hidden for so long. This hook sets the tone for what follows, a tale of secrets buried deep in the past, of a legacy of power and pain, and of the lives that were forever shaped by decisions made in the shadows. As the investigation into the letter unfolds, the narrative slowly begins to shift from the present day to the time of the events themselves. Washington, D.C., in the early 19th century, was a city in flux. It was a time of tremendous political upheaval, when the nation was still finding its footing and shaping its identity. Yet, beneath the veneer of progress and idealism, there was another, darker reality, slavery. For many powerful families in the South, slavery was not just an institution, but a foundation upon which their wealth and power were built. This shadowy backdrop forms the setting for the dark secret at the heart of the story. At the center of it all is the president, a figure who, by all outward appearances, seems to embody the ideals of democracy and freedom. He is hailed as a hero, a man of principle who fought for the independence of the nation and who, on the surface, values liberty above all else. His public persona is that of a family man, a figure of respectability, loved by the people for his leadership and vision. Yet, like many powerful men of his time, he is not without contradictions. Beneath the polished surface of his public image lies a man who is deeply entangled in the institution of slavery. And it is in this tangled web that the secret of his wife's enslaved sister, and the 6 children born from this forbidden union, begins to take form. The president's wife comes from a prominent Southern family. Their estate, large and imposing, is the epitome of wealth and privilege. But her family's success is built on the backs of enslaved people, many of whom serve the family in silence. Among them is her sister, a woman who is kept largely out of sight. Though she lives within the mansion, she is treated as little more than property. The bond between the 2 sisters is complex, and their lives are shaped by a system that sees them as unequal. The enslaved sister, despite her status, is inextricably linked to the family, though she is not allowed the same privileges as her freeborn sister. The existence of the enslaved sister and her relationship with the president's family is an open secret among the household staff. They speak in hushed tones of the strange dynamic between the 2 women, of the unspoken understanding that exists between the powerful family and the enslaved. The president's wife, though an active participant in the system of slavery, does not appear to exert any direct power over her sister's life. Yet, there are whispers that the enslaved woman is not entirely without influence. She has a presence that seems to linger even when she is not in the room, a quiet strength that hints at something more than mere servitude. It is within this framework of power, subjugation, and whispered secrets that the true nature of the president's relationship with his wife's enslaved sister begins to take shape. Although the facts are murky and unclear, there are accounts that suggest the two women shared more than a simple familial bond. The president's visits to the estate, often under the cover of night, lead to rumors that he is involved with his wife's sister in ways that go beyond the usual master-slave dynamic. There are whispers of late-night meetings, of intimate conversations held in the shadows of the estate. But it is not until the birth of 6 children, all fathered by the president, that the full scope of their relationship is revealed. The births are never publicly acknowledged. Instead, they are hidden away in the dark corners of the estate, where they are quietly passed off as the result of some inexplicable circumstance. The children, born of both black and white blood, are not welcome in either world. They are neither accepted by the free-born elite nor the enslaved community, and their existence is quietly erased from history. The president's wife, who is complicit in the creation of these children, never speaks of them, and they are raised away from the public eye, their names never recorded in official records. The documentary unfolds as a slow-burning investigation into the legacy of these hidden children and the dark secret that surrounds their birth. It focuses not only on the life of the president, but also on the lives of the enslaved sister and her children, who are left to carry the weight of a history that has been deliberately buried. The emotional toll of this hidden past is revealed in the poignant stories of the children, who grow up with no clear sense of identity or belonging. Their existence challenges the narrative of American greatness, exposing the contradictions at the heart of a nation that prided itself on its ideals of liberty and equality, yet built its foundations on the exploitation of others. This discovery is only the beginning of the story, but it is a powerful and chilling hook that sets the stage for the unraveling of a mystery that has remained hidden for more than a century. As the narrative progresses, the viewer is drawn deeper into a web of intrigue, where nothing is as it seems and where the truth is both more disturbing and more complex than anyone could have imagined. The emotional impact of the president's darkest secret resonates not only with the descendants of the children, but with the very soul of the nation itself, as it grapples with the uncomfortable truths that have been hidden for far too long. As the letter reveals its contents to the world, one is left to wonder how much of history remains shrouded in darkness, and how many other buried secrets are waiting to be uncovered. The stage is set in the South, a land where the wealth of the elite was measured by the number of acres they owned and the number of people they enslaved. The president's family hailed from such an estate, a sprawling plantation nestled in the heart of the region, where the very air seemed to hum with the weight of history. This was a world where the lines between power and oppression were blurred, and where lives were dictated by an unspoken hierarchy that few dared to challenge. The estate was a grand symbol of Southern aristocracy, its towering columns and ornate gardens standing in stark contrast to the lives of those who lived in its shadow. The mansion, a testament to the family's wealth and status, was surrounded by sprawling fields, tended by a large population of enslaved men, women, and children. These laborers, often forced to work under the harshest conditions, were not allowed the simplest rights, least of all the right to live as free people. Within the high gates of the estate, however, life proceeded with an air of pretension and civility, an illusion of benevolence that masked a much darker reality. At the center of this world was the president's wife, born into a family whose legacy was as tangled in blood and power as the land they controlled. She was raised to understand the rules of this society, the complex web of privilege and subjugation that governed every aspect of life. Though she enjoyed the luxuries afforded to her by her family's wealth, she was never truly free from the oppressive system that had shaped her world. Her life, like the lives of so many women of her time, was governed by the whims of men, by a marriage that was more political alliance than romantic bond. She was the embodiment of Southern grace, refined and composed in public, yet within the walls of her family's home, she carried the burden of a past that she could not escape. Her sister, the president's wife's enslaved sister, was born into an entirely different reality. While her sister was educated and groomed for a life of privilege, she was raised in the shadows of the estate, her existence barely acknowledged beyond the duties she performed. The enslaved sister, as she was known to the few who spoke of her, spent her days toiling in the fields and the kitchen, her every movement dictated by the whims of her owners. But despite her status as property, she was not without a sense of self. There was something about her, a quiet strength, a knowing look, that hinted at a depth far beyond what anyone expected from someone in her position. She was not entirely invisible, and in the hushed corners of the estate, there were whispers that she carried with her a power that others could not quite place. Her presence in the household was an open secret. To the family, she was nothing more than a servant, someone to be kept in her place and out of sight. But the truth was more complicated. She was not just a slave, she was family. The sisters had grown up together, but their bond was never equal. The enslaved sister, though never treated as an equal, was still tied to the family in a way that defied the rigid social structures of the time. She had a quiet, almost imperceptible power, and those who worked within the household knew that her relationship with the president's wife was not one of mere obligation but something more complex, layered with an unspoken understanding. While the wife's family had perfected the art of controlling the lives of their slaves, her sister's relationship with the family was far more complicated. As much as she was a part of the estate, she was also a silent observer of its contradictions. She saw the way her sister was treated with respect and privilege, even as she herself was forced to endure the harshest conditions. And she saw the way the president, a man of great political power, had begun to make more frequent visits to the estate. At first, these visits seemed innocent enough, part of the social duties that the president was obliged to perform. But over time, they began to take on a different tone. Late-night conversations behind closed doors, shared moments that no one else could witness, and an intimacy that was hard to ignore all began to hint at something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of their respective roles. This hidden relationship, though never spoken of, was felt by those who worked on the estate. The slaves who labored there, though forbidden to discuss matters of personal import, could not help but notice the strange atmosphere between the two women and the president. Whispers began to circulate among the staff, but these were not the kind of stories one could openly share. To speak of such things was to risk one's own safety. But the rumor mill continued to churn, and the mysterious relationship between the president, his wife, and her sister took on a life of its own in hushed conversations and exchanged glances. The relationship between the president and his wife's enslaved sister was not one of simple affection, it was a complex and tangled web of power, desire, and secrecy. The enslaved sister was never the equal of the president's wife, but in the hidden spaces between the walls of the mansion, she and the president shared something that no one else could see. Their connection was not based on love in the traditional sense but rather on something more primal, an attraction born of a shared loneliness, a bond formed in the shadows. It was this connection that would lead to the most tragic of consequences, one that would alter the course of history in ways no one could have predicted. The births of the 6 children fathered by the president were not merely acts of passion, they were the culmination of a larger and darker reality. Each child, born of the union between the president and his wife's enslaved sister, was a reminder of the complex, exploitative, and often contradictory nature of the society in which they lived. These children, though born into the world as the president's heirs, were never afforded the same privileges. They were never allowed to sit at the table of power, nor were they ever truly accepted by the family. Their lives were shaped by the very thing that gave them life, slavery. They were, in every sense of the word, the illegitimate children of a system that saw them as less than human. The story of these children, though largely forgotten by history, is one of immense emotional weight. For their mother, the enslaved sister, these children represented both a deep love and a profound betrayal. She had given them life, but in doing so, had tied them to a system that would never recognize their humanity. They were both a symbol of the cruelty of slavery and a testament to the unspoken bonds that formed between people in a world defined by inequality. As the story unfolds, the true depth of the president's betrayal begins to emerge. The family's estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, becomes a prison for those who are trapped by the system of slavery. The children of the president and his wife's sister are forced to live in the margins, their existence erased from the official records, and their very names lost to time. They are raised in isolation, never allowed to mingle with the other children of the household. The legacy of their birth, though hidden from public view, becomes a haunting presence in the lives of those who are forced to bear its weight. This is the world in which the story of the president's darkest secret begins to take shape. It is a world defined by power and oppression, where those who have the most control are the ones who shape the narrative of history. And it is a world where the lives of the oppressed are often forgotten, their voices silenced by the very system that claims to protect them. As we begin to explore the president's life and the hidden truth of his relationship with his wife's enslaved sister, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality of American history, a history that has long been swept under the rug in favor of more comfortable, palatable narratives. The president, for all his public greatness, was not immune to the very system that he helped to sustain. His private actions, hidden from public view, reflect the darker side of the nation's struggle for freedom and equality. And in the quiet corners of the estate, where the president's secret children were born, the true cost of this hidden history begins to come into focus. The whispers began as murmurs, faint and easily dismissed by those who were too afraid or too comfortable to listen. At first, they were nothing more than idle gossip exchanged in the corners of the grand estate, the type of gossip that was never meant to leave the confines of the household. Yet, over time, these murmurs began to grow louder, their weight impossible to ignore. The servants, those who lived in the shadows of the mansion and were forced to keep their heads down, began to speak of strange occurrences, things that could not easily be explained away. The president's frequent visits to the estate, the hidden conversations held in the dead of night, the quiet but unmistakable presence of the enslaved sister, all of these things added to the growing sense that something was wrong, something far darker than anyone dared to admit. It was not just the adults who noticed. The children who lived in the house, too, began to ask questions. They were curious, their young minds too innocent to fully understand the complexities of power and control that shaped their world, but they noticed the tension, the awkward silences, the way people avoided certain subjects. To them, the household was an intricate web of contradictions, love and hatred, care and neglect, privilege and suffering. They could not yet comprehend the nuances of these emotions, but they could feel the undercurrent of something sinister running beneath the surface. In time, the whispers turned into more direct signs, and the atmosphere within the estate became charged with a sense of unease. The enslaved sister, who had always been kept at the periphery of the household's affairs, began to appear more frequently in the corners of the estate. She would be seen late at night, walking alone through the gardens or standing at the window of the mansion, staring out into the darkness. It was as though she were waiting for something, or someone. Her presence, once a shadow, had now become undeniable, and the question on everyone's mind was not just why she was there, but what exactly she was waiting for. Some of the more perceptive servants began to notice a pattern. The enslaved sister, once a silent observer, seemed to be growing more confident, more assertive in her place within the household. It was as if she was taking on a role that no one had expected of her. She was still not treated as an equal, of course, but there was a shift in the power dynamic, a subtle, yet unmistakable shift. The president, who had always kept a careful distance from the enslaved workers on the estate, seemed to be spending more time with her in private. Conversations took place behind closed doors, late into the night. Sometimes, the sounds of laughter could be heard, though no one could ever make out the words. It was a closeness that should not have existed, a familiarity that felt entirely out of place. And then there were the children. The estate, usually a place of order and structure, was beginning to feel more like a place of chaos. The birth of 6 children, each fathered by the president himself, was a deeply troubling event, one that could not be ignored, even if it was never spoken of aloud. At first, the children were hidden away, kept out of sight and far from the prying eyes of society. But the whispers about them grew. The staff spoke of hearing faint cries coming from the hidden rooms, of catching glimpses of children playing in the garden who seemed to be neither fully black nor fully white. These children, though they were part of the very family that owned the estate, were never given the same status or privileges as the president's legitimate offspring. They were treated like ghosts, present, yet invisible. They were shadows in a world that did not know how to acknowledge them. For those who worked in the household, the presence of these children was a stark reminder of the cruel reality of the world they lived in. The children were the embodiment of the system of slavery that had been built into the very fabric of their society, a system that treated human beings as property, to be used and discarded at the whim of those in power. Yet, these children were different. They were a reminder that even in a world built on oppression, the complexities of human desire, love, and betrayal could not be so easily erased. The children's existence, though hidden, became a painful reminder of the contradictions that defined the household, and by extension, the society in which it operated. The children, for their part, seemed to exist in a world of their own. They were raised in isolation, far removed from the other children in the estate, but they were not entirely ignored. They had their own space, their own small corner of the world, but it was a space that was always just out of reach from the rest of the family. They were neither fully accepted by the president's family nor fully embraced by the enslaved people who worked on the estate. They were caught between two worlds, never truly belonging to either. And while they may have been treated with a degree of care, there were even rumors that the president had taken an interest in their education. They were always reminded of their place in the grand scheme of things. They were, in the eyes of society, illegitimate. Their existence was something to be hidden, something to be explained away. But despite their invisibility, the children's presence was inescapable. The estate itself, which had once felt like a place of order, now seemed like a prison of secrets. The house creaked and groaned with the weight of those secrets, and the more the whispers spread, the more palpable the tension became. It wasn't just the staff who were beginning to notice, there were other, more dangerous eyes on the estate as well. The president's wife, who had once maintained a delicate balance between her public life and her private pain, began to notice the cracks in the facade. She could feel the weight of the whispers, the stares, the unspoken judgments. It was as if the very walls of the mansion were closing in on her, reminding her that no matter how carefully she tried to hide the truth, it would eventually come to light. The president's wife, once a figure of grace and composure, found herself caught in a web of her own making. She had long known about the children, of course, she had seen them born, raised them in secret, but she had never allowed herself to fully confront what their existence meant. She had chosen to ignore the truth, to turn a blind eye to the growing shadows in the house. But now, as the whispers grew louder and the tension more palpable, she could no longer deny what had been happening behind closed doors. The questions began to surface: how could she have allowed this? How could she have known what was happening and yet done nothing? And, perhaps most chilling of all, what would happen if the truth were to come out? The tension in the estate began to manifest in ways that were impossible to ignore. Servants grew more nervous, their conversations more hushed. Even those who had always turned a blind eye to the darker side of the estate could not ignore the growing sense of unease that hung in the air. The president's visits became more frequent, more secretive. He appeared at odd hours, often when no one was expecting him, and no one ever knew what took place in those private meetings with his wife's sister. But the impact of those meetings was evident. The more the whispers spread, the more strained the atmosphere became. The president, for all his power, could not control the stories that were being whispered about him. And as the whispers grew, so too did the suspicion. There was a palpable sense that something would break, that the secret, which had been carefully concealed for so long, would eventually come to light. And when it did, it would change everything. In the weeks and months that followed, the air on the estate became thick with uncertainty. The children's existence, once so carefully hidden, had begun to surface in conversations, in stories exchanged in the shadows. It was only a matter of time before the truth would be forced into the open, and when it did, the very fabric of the family's legacy would be torn apart. The whispers, once dismissed as nothing more than idle gossip, had grown into something much more dangerous. And in their wake, nothing would ever be the same again. As the whispers grew louder, the fear of exposure also deepened. It was not just the servants who were noticing, even the most loyal family members began to sense that something was amiss. Conversations, once carefree, now carried a quiet weight, and the atmosphere in the estate shifted from a place of comfort to one of constant tension. The ever-present uncertainty cast a shadow over every room, and the once grand, stately estate began to feel more like a prison. Each day, the threat of discovery loomed larger, as though something unseen was quietly tightening its grip on everyone within those walls. At first, it was the smaller things, an awkward silence when the president arrived, a certain coldness that hung in the air when he left the room, or the way the servants would lower their voices when he passed. These subtle shifts went largely unnoticed by the powerful family, but for those who worked beneath them, the changes were impossible to ignore. The sense of unease that had begun with the rumors of strange visits and secret conversations had now permeated every aspect of life at the estate. No one spoke directly of what was happening, but the signs were there. The tension was tangible. It wasn't just the staff who began to feel the weight of these secrets. The children who had grown up with the president's family, the legitimate heirs to the estate, began to notice the peculiarities, too. They had always been taught to keep their thoughts to themselves, to act with propriety and grace. But the younger generation, with their growing awareness, started to ask questions that no one had ever dared speak aloud before. They looked at the children born of the enslaved sister, the 6 children who were kept hidden away in the shadows of the estate, and they wondered. Why weren't they ever seen in public? Why were they kept out of the family's affairs? Why was their existence so carefully concealed? The older members of the family, who had always turned a blind eye to the reality of their wealth and power, began to react with increasing defensiveness. They made excuses, brushed aside the questions, and even became agitated when those uncomfortable topics surfaced. The fear of what would happen if the truth about the president's relationship with his wife's enslaved sister became public was palpable. It wasn't just about the scandal of a man in power betraying his wife, it was about the very foundation of the family's legacy being shattered. The president's entire reputation, built over years of service to the nation, would be tarnished, and everything the family had worked for would be called into question. The secrecy was not just a matter of personal guilt or shame, it was about preserving the myth of a perfect, untouchable family. The president's wife, long aware of the delicate balance she had to maintain, began to feel the cracks in that facade. For years, she had chosen to ignore the truths she knew about her husband's actions, focusing instead on maintaining the public image of a devoted wife and mother. But as the whispers grew louder and the questions from her children became harder to ignore, she found herself at a crossroads. The weight of her silence was beginning to crush her, and the guilt of knowing the truth without confronting it became unbearable. Her relationship with her husband, once built on affection and duty, had turned into a precarious balancing act. She had chosen to look the other way, to ignore the uncomfortable truths about their shared life. But now, as the world around her began to unravel, she couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could maintain the delicate illusion she had so carefully constructed. One evening, as the president was scheduled to visit the estate again, the growing anxiety reached its peak. The house was eerily quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The servants exchanged nervous glances, knowing that something was bound to change. The family was tense, their interactions forced, each person caught in their own internal battle, torn between the duty of silence and the desperate need to expose the truth. The president's wife, now more anxious than ever, found herself unable to focus on the tasks at hand. Her thoughts were preoccupied with the implications of everything she knew. She knew that her children, who had once been protected from the horrors of the estate's legacy, would soon have to face the truth. How would they react when they discovered the reality of their family's history? How would they respond to the existence of their half-siblings, hidden away in the shadows, invisible in the eyes of society? It wasn't long before one of the younger members of the family, an inquisitive child, decided to venture beyond the carefully curated image of the estate. Driven by an intuitive sense that something was terribly wrong, the child began to ask questions. The answers, of course, were far from satisfactory. The staff, fearful of reprisal, refused to speak openly. But the child persisted, asking questions of the adults around them, cornering them with quiet inquiries that they could no longer ignore. They asked why certain rooms in the mansion were always locked. They asked why the enslaved sister was treated with a strange reverence, never quite a servant, but never quite a member of the family either. And, most of all, they asked about the children, those 6 mysterious children who never seemed to leave the estate, never seen in public, never acknowledged in the way that other children were. The whispers that had once been hidden in the corners of the estate were now becoming louder, and the truth, though still unspoken, was slowly beginning to surface. The family, once so skilled at maintaining their image, found themselves backed into a corner. The president, aware of the growing unrest, took more frequent visits to the estate, his presence both a comfort and a cause of anxiety. The pressure of maintaining the illusion was beginning to break him down, too. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now, he found himself unable to silence the growing questions, the uncomfortable stares, and the mounting pressure to confront the truth. During one of his visits, when the house was in a rare moment of quiet, the president's wife approached him. She had been trying to avoid the inevitable for years, but now, with everything on the verge of unraveling, she had no choice but to confront him. The conversation that ensued was long and painful. The wife, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear, demanded answers. She asked why he had never spoken of the children, why they had never been acknowledged in public, why their existence had been kept so carefully hidden. The president, always a master of deflection, attempted to soothe her, but his words lacked conviction. He had no good answer, no justification that could make the truth any less appalling. It was in this moment, when the veil between them began to crack, that the full weight of their shared secret became impossible to ignore. The president's wife was not the only one who had been living in denial for so long. The president, too, had been complicit in a history that he now knew could never be erased. The guilt that had been festering beneath the surface for years finally surfaced, and both of them were forced to confront the reality of what had been done. The truth, though still buried, was no longer something that could be ignored. The tension within the household, once a quiet undertone, now reached a fever pitch. The children of the enslaved sister, whom no one had spoken of in years, became more than just an uncomfortable secret, they were a symbol of everything the family had tried to hide. And soon, the walls that had kept that secret safe would begin to crumble, revealing the full extent of the dark legacy that had been carefully concealed for so long. The truth, like a tidal wave, was on the verge of breaking through, and no one in the family, no matter how powerful or untouchable they once seemed, could stop it. The fear of exposure continued to grip the estate like an unseen hand tightening its hold around everyone's throat. It wasn't just the servants who felt the weight of the secret, even those in positions of great power within the household were beginning to crack under the pressure. The president, usually a man who seemed so composed, now appeared nervous, restless, his visits to the estate becoming less frequent, almost as though he feared the walls themselves would reveal the truth that he had spent years carefully concealing. The president's wife, too, had begun to withdraw into herself, retreating from public view, her once graceful presence now tinged with anxiety and guilt. She could no longer pretend that everything was as it should be, that the family's reputation would remain untarnished. No matter how hard she tried, the truth was beginning to seep into every corner of their lives, like poison creeping through the cracks of a fragile vessel. The mansion, once a place of wealth and power, now felt cold and oppressive, the shadows of its history growing longer with every passing day. The once meticulously cared for estate now seemed like a haunted relic, its grand halls and ornate furniture hiding secrets that no one could bear to acknowledge. Every room seemed to echo with the unspoken truths of the past. The grand parlor, where the president and his wife once held social gatherings to present themselves as the epitome of respectability, now felt like a stage, a place where the curtains were about to be drawn back to reveal the sordid drama that had been unfolding behind closed doors. The once sturdy walls, which had borne witness to years of wealth and power, now seemed fragile and ready to collapse under the weight of the family's darkest secret. The tension was palpable. The servants, once passive observers of the family's affairs, now began to sense that something was changing. No longer were they just watching the family from the margins, they were now participants in the unraveling of the family's carefully constructed world. As whispers of the hidden children grew louder, so too did the fear of what might happen if the truth came to light. It wasn't just the scandal of the president's actions that worried them, it was the violent repercussions of speaking out. In a world where silence was a form of survival, the fear of reprisal was as powerful as the fear of exposure. The servants, each one bound by their own personal struggles and desires to protect their families, found themselves caught in a dangerous dilemma. If they spoke, they risked losing everything they had worked for, everything they had built. But if they stayed silent, they would be complicit in a lie that was growing harder to hide. The household staff was divided. Some remained loyal, sticking to the unspoken rule that one did not speak of the family's secrets, while others began to show signs of quiet rebellion. Some of them began to talk to each other more openly, exchanging glances when the president arrived, murmuring about what they knew, what they had seen, and what they suspected. For the first time, the seemingly impenetrable walls of the estate felt permeable. The fear of the family's wrath began to clash with a growing sense of moral responsibility. There were a few among the staff who believed that the truth needed to be exposed, no matter the consequences. But for most, the risk of speaking out was too great, and so they continued in their quiet servitude, unwilling to challenge the power that had held them in place for so long. And then there were the children, the 6 illegitimate offspring of the president and his wife's enslaved sister. For all the efforts to conceal their existence, the children were becoming harder to ignore. They had been kept hidden away in the darkest corners of the estate, far from the public eye, but the very secrecy that surrounded them made them all the more conspicuous. Their existence was the unspeakable truth at the heart of the family, the wound that could not be healed, the scar that marred the legacy of an otherwise noble family. Even if the world never knew their names, even if their births were never officially recorded, the children could not be erased. They existed as a silent challenge to the public image the family had worked so hard to cultivate, a reminder that beneath the facade of respectability, there were uncomfortable truths that threatened to tear the family apart. As the children grew older, the divide between them and the rest of the family became more pronounced. Though they were technically part of the family, they were treated as something else entirely. They were relegated to the shadows, their lives confined to the margins, never allowed to partake in the privileges and opportunities that the legitimate children enjoyed. The president's wife, who had been complicit in their births, could never bring herself to truly embrace them. She could never love them in the way a mother should love her children. They were reminders of the deepest betrayal of all, the betrayal of her own blood, the betrayal of the very family she had sworn to protect. It was a cruelty she could not escape, and the guilt weighed heavily on her. Meanwhile, the children, in their own way, began to sense the disparity in their treatment. Though they were never explicitly told why they were different, they could feel it. The glances from the other children, the subtle exclusion from family events, the deliberate avoidance of their presence, all of these things left scars. The children were caught in a limbo, unable to find their place in a world that had no room for them. They were neither fully accepted by the enslaved community nor welcomed into the family. They were the product of an illicit relationship, and society had no place for such children. In the midst of all this, the president's wife found herself at a crossroads. Her guilt had always been a quiet companion, but now, with the walls of the estate closing in, it had become a constant, gnawing presence. She had spent years suppressing the truth, convincing herself that silence was the only way to maintain order. But now, as the family began to unravel, she knew that silence could no longer protect them. The weight of her complicity was crushing, and she could feel the emotional distance between herself and the rest of her family growing. She no longer recognized the people she had once called loved ones. The president, a man who had once been her confidant, was now a stranger, distant, cold, and consumed by the same fear that gripped her. The president, too, was beginning to feel the strain. He had long been a man of public stature, a person of great influence and power, but now he was no longer sure where that power came from. He had built his reputation on his ability to maintain control, to keep the truth hidden behind layers of politeness and order. But now, as the tension in the household reached a boiling point, he found that even his power could not protect him. The children's presence was a constant reminder of his failure, and his inability to erase the evidence of his actions filled him with self-loathing. The secret, once a simple matter of concealment, had become a monster he could no longer tame. It was only a matter of time before it would break free and expose him for what he truly was, a man whose carefully constructed image was built on a foundation of lies. The family's dynamic, once one of apparent harmony, had fractured irreparably. The president's wife, now living in quiet despair, found herself unable to shield her children from the reality of their family's legacy. The once proud family was now a house divided, caught between the image of respectability and the truth that could tear it all down. The president, a man who had always prided himself on his strength, was now consumed by fear. The estate, once a symbol of wealth and power, had become a prison, and the family had become its prisoners. In the midst of it all, the children, those 6 lives, born into a world of secrecy and shame, remained in the shadows, ignored and forgotten, but never truly invisible. Their existence was the dark heart of the story, the secret that no one could ever truly escape. The weight of their lives would linger, like a curse that would follow the family for generations. The truth, however carefully concealed, was always there, waiting to rise to the surface. And when it did, no amount of wealth, power, or influence would be enough to protect those who had built their empire on the suffering of others. The atmosphere inside the mansion had shifted again, a growing sense of inevitability hanging over every conversation, every glance exchanged between the family members and the staff. The secret that had been so carefully hidden for so long was no longer something that could be ignored. The tension was palpable, thick in the air like the heavy humidity of a storm waiting to break. The longer the truth remained buried, the more dangerous it became. It had spread through the walls of the estate, like a poison slowly infecting everything it touched. No one was immune. Each member of the family, each person who worked within the confines of the estate, felt the suffocating weight of it. Despite the careful control that the president had exerted over the household, despite the years of hiding his relationship with his wife's enslaved sister and the existence of his illegitimate children, the walls were beginning to close in. The president's visits to the estate had become erratic, sporadic. He was no longer a constant presence in the lives of his family. His absences were growing longer, and when he was present, he seemed distant, almost a shadow of the man he had once been. His reputation, carefully cultivated over the years, was beginning to crack, and he could feel it. His sense of invincibility had shattered, replaced by a fear he had never known before, the fear of exposure, of being torn down by the very secrets he had spent a lifetime trying to suppress. For his wife, the burden was even greater. She had spent years playing the role of the dutiful wife, the mother of the legitimate children, the person who kept up the family's image of perfection. But as the weeks passed, it became harder for her to continue wearing the mask of composure. The reality of what had transpired in the shadows of her home was becoming more difficult to ignore. She had known for so long what was happening behind closed doors, and she had convinced herself that silence was the best course of action. But now, she couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was as it should be. The guilt was overwhelming. She knew that her silence had allowed the president's betrayal to continue unchecked, and in doing so, she had allowed the deep divide between the family and the enslaved people to fester. The very foundation of her life, the image of respectability that she had so carefully crafted, was beginning to crumble. For the children, the ones who had been born of the president and his wife's enslaved sister, the effects of this secret were more profound. They had grown up in a world where their existence was not only ignored but denied. They were the children no one spoke of, the ones who were hidden away in the shadows, their lives not even recognized in the family's records. The president's legitimate children, those born into the light, lived their lives without a second thought about their half-siblings, who lived in the margins. The disparity between their treatment was glaringly apparent to the children born in the shadows. They could never be part of the family's world. They were not allowed to play in the same spaces, not allowed to attend the same events. They were treated differently by the household staff, not with the respect afforded to the president's legitimate children, but with a kind of silent indifference. Yet, despite their invisible status, these children were not without a certain awareness of their difference. They may not have understood the complexities of their parentage, but they sensed the weight of the secrecy that hung over them. They noticed the way the servants would avoid looking them in the eye, the way the other children would pretend not to see them. They understood, even at a young age, that their existence was something that was to be hidden away, something that was not to be spoken of. And though they were raised in the darkness of the estate, away from the prying eyes of the public, they could still feel the sharp edges of exclusion. For the enslaved sister, the mother of these children, the experience was even more painful. She had given life to the president's children, a union that, in the eyes of the world, should have been nothing more than a violation of the system of slavery that bound her. She was still, by all accounts, a slave, a person with no rights, no voice, no power. Yet, she carried the weight of her children with her, and the burden of their existence was one she could never fully shake off. She had brought them into a world where they were treated as less than human, where their existence was a stain on the family that owned them. They were, in a sense, her children, but they were also a symbol of the exploitation that had shaped her life, and that had shaped the life of every other person on the estate. As the days wore on, the strain within the family only grew. The president, once a figure of command, was now reduced to a man consumed by guilt and fear. He could no longer hide from the truth. His carefully constructed facade of power and control had fractured, and now, even his allies within the estate were beginning to turn on him. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent. The staff, once loyal to the family, had begun to speak to each other more openly. The secret of the president's relationship with his wife's enslaved sister and the 6 children he had fathered was no longer just a murmur behind closed doors, it was something that everyone knew, something that everyone could feel. The president, though a man of influence, found himself in a position he had never been in before, vulnerable. His power, once an unshakable force, now seemed like a fragile illusion, one that could be shattered at any moment. The walls of the estate, which had once been symbols of his wealth and status, now felt like prisons, confining him to a world of guilt and suspicion. The reality of his actions, the betrayal of his wife and the children he had fathered in secret, was something he could no longer escape. And no matter how many attempts he made to restore order, to quiet the whispers, the truth would not stay hidden forever. The pressure was beginning to take its toll on everyone involved. The president's wife, whose silence had enabled the situation to fester, now found herself at a crossroads. She could no longer keep pretending that everything was fine, that their family was perfect. The facade of normalcy was crumbling, and she was forced to confront the reality of her complicity. She had spent so many years trying to keep up appearances, to protect her children from the harshness of the world outside. But now, the weight of her actions, her silence, her acceptance, was too much to bear. She could no longer ignore the consequences of the decisions that had been made in the past. The truth, as painful as it was, had to come to light. It wasn't just the president's wife who was struggling with the weight of the secret. The entire household had begun to fracture under the pressure. The children, the ones born into the dark corners of the estate, were becoming more aware of the world around them. They began to ask questions, questions that no one was willing to answer. Why were they treated so differently from the other children? Why were they never allowed to be part of the family's life? Why were they hidden away in the farthest corners of the estate? And, most haunting of all, who were they really? The truth was becoming undeniable. The president's actions could no longer be dismissed, his betrayal could no longer be ignored. The children, though once invisible, were now demanding to be seen. The silence that had protected the family for so long was beginning to unravel, and the question that loomed over the estate was no longer just about the president's guilt, it was about what would happen when the truth finally came out. Would the family be able to survive the storm that was coming, or would it be torn apart by the very secrets it had worked so hard to keep hidden? The estate was no longer a place of grandeur. It was a house filled with brokenness, guilt, and fear. The power that had once been so secure was now a fleeting illusion, and the family's dark secrets were on the verge of being exposed to the world. No one in the household could escape the consequences of the truth. They were all bound together by the weight of their silence, and as the storm grew closer, it was clear that no one would leave the estate unchanged. The president, the wife, the children, Everyone was about to face the consequences of the choices that had been made. And when the truth came out, there would be no turning back. As the days dragged on, the house became more like a living tomb, the corridors of the estate steeped in an unnatural silence. The echoes of footsteps seemed to reverberate louder than they ever had before, as if the very walls of the mansion were conspiring to carry the heavy weight of unspoken truths. The air, thick with the anticipation of something inevitable, was stifling. It was not just the servants who felt it, but even the family members themselves, each of them burdened by the knowledge that the walls of their carefully constructed world were starting to collapse. They could no longer ignore the reality of what had been happening behind closed doors. The president, once a figure of unassailable authority, was becoming a mere shell of the man he had once been. The fear of discovery was etched into every line of his face, and it seemed to weigh heavily on him in ways that no one could have predicted. The fortress of his reputation, built over years of public service and personal success, was crumbling beneath the crushing weight of his own secrets. The president's wife, too, felt the tightening noose of the truth, a truth she had long been unwilling to confront. She had spent so many years pretending, maintaining the illusion of a perfect family life, convincing herself that she could protect her children from the grim realities that had shaped her own. But now, the facade was crumbling, and with it, any sense of control she had once held. She found herself constantly on edge, her every step weighed down by the knowledge that the walls around them were closing in. She had once believed that if she remained silent, the secret could be kept. But now, she realized that silence had only allowed the darkness to grow, fed by years of avoidance and denial. Her guilt, once a dull ache, now felt like a jagged wound that would never heal. She could no longer bear the thought of what would happen if the truth were to come to light, but she also knew that it was no longer something she could suppress. For the children born of the president and his wife's enslaved sister, the growing tension in the household had a far more personal effect. They had always been invisible, trapped in the margins of the family's world, hidden away from the public eye, their existence barely acknowledged by the people who had brought them into being. But now, as the whispers became more urgent, as the air in the estate grew thicker with the weight of the truth, the children began to ask questions that no one could ignore. They had been living in the shadows for so long, but the realization that they were different from the other children in the house, the legitimate children, had finally begun to penetrate their young minds. They could not help but notice the way they were treated, the way they were kept at arm's length, as though they were not fully part of the family. The other children, the ones who were born into the light, lived their lives without a second thought about the existence of their half-siblings. For them, the 6 children were nothing more than distant ghosts, figures who haunted the periphery of the family's life but were never truly included in it. The children's awareness of their status, of the gulf between their lives and the lives of their siblings, began to grow as they reached adolescence. They started to piece together the reality of their situation. They were not given the same privileges, not allowed to participate in the same family events, nor were they included in the decisions that affected the family's future. They were not permitted to sit at the same table, to partake in the same celebrations. They were hidden away, their existence relegated to the shadows. Even though they were, biologically, part of the family, the stark contrast between their lives and those of their legitimate siblings spoke volumes. It was an undeniable pain, one that became more pronounced as the children grew older. They began to speak to each other more openly, sharing their confusion, their anger, and their hurt. Though they had always been told that they were loved, that they had a place within the family, their lives told a different story. They were treated as if they were less than human, less than their half-siblings, and their treatment mirrored the reality of the larger system that had defined their world. Their lives were the product of an illicit relationship, one that had taken place behind closed doors, and society had no place for them. They were neither fully accepted by the enslaved people on the estate nor fully embraced by the white family to whom they were connected by blood. Their existence, though a direct consequence of the president's actions, had become a silent testament to the cruelty of a system that allowed such a relationship to exist in the first place. They had no claim to their father's name, no claim to his wealth or position, and yet they were still tied to him, their very lives a reminder of the inequalities that had shaped their world. And as the tension within the estate grew, so too did their awareness of the truth about who they were and what that truth meant for their future. In the midst of this turmoil, the enslaved sister, the mother of these children, found herself caught between conflicting desires. She had never asked for her children to be part of the family in the way they had been forced to exist. She had never asked for the president's attention, for his affection, for the pain that had come with it. And yet, in the deepest corners of her heart, she had always wished for something different for her children. She had wished that they could be free, that they could live their lives without the chains of slavery or the weight of their father's betrayal hanging over them. She had longed for them to be acknowledged as human beings, to be treated with the dignity and respect that all children deserve. But the world they lived in had made that impossible. As much as she wanted to protect them from the brutal reality of their existence, she knew that the moment of reckoning was drawing near. She could feel the change in the air, the sense that something would soon snap. The walls, once sturdy and secure, were beginning to tremble under the weight of the truth. She knew that the time was coming when the family's carefully guarded secrets would be exposed, and she wondered what that would mean for her children. Would they finally be seen for who they were? Or would they be condemned to live in the shadows forever, denied the chance to live full lives because of their heritage? For the president, the days of denial were numbered. His carefully controlled life, the one he had built on a foundation of power and prestige, was beginning to slip from his grasp. His influence, once all-encompassing, was no longer enough to hold the truth at bay. The staff, who had long been complicit in the family's charade, were beginning to turn on him, their loyalty starting to fracture. The once tightly controlled environment of the estate was now filled with nervous glances and hushed conversations, each person keenly aware that they were living in a house of cards, one that could collapse at any moment. The president could feel it. The weight of the guilt, the weight of the secret, was becoming unbearable. He knew that he could not keep hiding forever. The truth was coming, and he could not stop it. For his wife, the slow disintegration of her carefully curated world had become a torture of its own. She could no longer live in the illusion of control she had worked so hard to maintain. She had spent so many years convincing herself that silence was the best way forward, that by ignoring the pain and suffering around her, she could protect her children and preserve the family's reputation. But now, she realized, silence had only made the problem worse. The weight of her complicity, the knowledge that she had allowed this tragedy to unfold, was slowly suffocating her. She had always believed that her love for her children and her husband could mask the deeper rot within the family, but now she saw that nothing could change the truth. The time for denial was over. The lies that had been built upon years of manipulation, secrecy, and silence were beginning to break down. The family was on the verge of an emotional collapse, and there was nothing that could stop it. The president, his wife, the enslaved sister, and the children, they were all caught in a cycle of guilt, fear, and betrayal, one that had been set in motion long before any of them had fully realized what it would cost them. The truth was about to come crashing down, and when it did, it would change everything. The estate, once a symbol of power and prosperity, was now a house of secrets, a place where the truth was buried so deep that even the foundations themselves seemed to tremble in anticipation of its eventual unveiling. And when the storm came, no one would be left untouched. The estate, once a sanctuary of power, wealth, and control, was now a place on the brink of collapse, with the mounting tension suffocating every inch of the mansion. The president, whose name had once been synonymous with authority and respect, was now a man trapped within the very walls he had built to protect his secrets. His past actions, hidden behind a lifetime of public service and calculated decisions, had led him to this point, an inevitable unraveling that he could neither predict nor stop. The walls of the estate, which had for so long been the guardians of his family's reputation, were now the very things that seemed to close in on him. The silence, once comforting, now felt oppressive, a constant reminder of the lies that had been buried for so long. Each day, he awoke with a growing sense of dread, knowing that the time was fast approaching when the truth could no longer be concealed. His wife, once a partner in maintaining the facade of perfection, was no longer able to ignore the deep cracks in their world. She had spent years convincing herself that her silence was a form of protection, that by turning a blind eye to the darkest parts of their lives, she could shield their children from the consequences of their father's actions. But now, the weight of her own complicity was too great to bear. Every glance between her and the president seemed to carry the unspoken knowledge of the lies they had lived. She could no longer pretend that everything was as it should be. Her denial had allowed the situation to fester, and now the moment of reckoning was upon them. She had always believed that their love, their devotion to family, would somehow be enough to keep the darkness at bay. But now, that love seemed like a hollow promise, a fragile veneer that had cracked under the strain of truth. The president's wife had begun to withdraw more and more, retreating into herself as the pressure grew. She had become a shadow of the woman she once was, no longer certain of her place in the family she had helped create. Her once sturdy identity as the perfect matron of the estate, the embodiment of grace and dignity, was beginning to crumble. She had always carried the guilt of her husband's actions in silence, believing that by keeping up appearances, she could protect her children and maintain the illusion of a happy family. But the truth was no longer something she could hide from. She had ignored the mounting signs, the increasing whispers, and the widening rift between herself and her children. The moment of truth was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The children, those born in the shadows, the 6 who had been hidden away for so long, had reached an age where they could no longer accept the false narratives that had been constructed around them. For years, they had been told that their existence was a secret, that they were to remain out of the public eye, away from the prying eyes of society. But with each passing day, the weight of their exclusion grew heavier. They could see how differently they were treated, how they were forced to remain in the background while the legitimate children of the president and his wife took center stage. They had been denied their rightful place in the family, denied the privilege of enjoying the same opportunities, the same recognition, as the others. It was a cruelty that became more apparent as they grew older, as they began to realize that they had been born into a world where their very existence was deemed an inconvenient truth, one that had to be hidden from the world. They started to question the reality of their situation. They noticed the way the servants treated them differently, the way the legitimate children seemed to have access to everything they could never have. It was as though they were ghosts, invisible to the world around them. And as they grew older, they began to understand the nature of their birth, the implications of their mother's forced submission to the president's will, and the deeper injustices that had shaped their lives. The truth was slowly seeping into their minds, and the realization was a bitter one. They were not like the others. They were not truly part of the family. They were the product of a hidden, forbidden relationship, and that truth would follow them for the rest of their lives. One day, as the tension in the household reached its peak, one of the children, driven by a growing sense of frustration and anger, decided to confront the president's wife. The child, once so passive and quiet, now stood before the woman who had been the center of their world, demanding answers. "Why are we kept hidden?" the child asked, their voice shaking with the weight of years of silence. "Why are we not like the others?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, the wife found herself unable to offer a comforting answer. She had long ago silenced the questions, buried them deep within herself, but now they were being thrust back into the open, demanding to be addressed. The president's wife, caught off guard by the intensity of the child's words, could feel her heart race. She wanted to explain, to soothe them with the comforting lies she had told herself for so long. But the truth was too loud to ignore. She could not hide behind the veil of denial any longer. The reality of the situation, the deep injustice that her own children had endured, was too much to bear. She had kept them in the dark, kept them in the shadows, to protect the image of a perfect family. But now, that image was shattering, and there was no turning back. The child's question seemed to echo throughout the mansion, reverberating in every corner of the house. For the first time, the silence that had once been a shield now felt like a prison. The truth was no longer something that could be avoided or denied. The weight of it hung over everyone in the estate, suffocating them with its heaviness. The family, once so united in their effort to conceal the truth, was now splintering under the strain of their own lies. As the days passed, the pressure continued to build. The president, already fragile from the weight of his own guilt, found himself unable to face the truth any longer. He had spent his life hiding behind the facade of respectability, but now that facade was crumbling, and he could not stop it. The children, once invisible and silent, were now demanding to be seen. They could no longer accept their place in the shadows, and their questions were only growing louder. The president's wife, too, found herself torn between the life she had tried to protect and the reality she could no longer ignore. The family's secrets, once so carefully guarded, were now on the verge of being exposed. It was in these final days of tension that the truth finally began to seep into the open. The walls of the estate, once impenetrable, were now trembling under the weight of the lies that had been built into its very foundations. The servants, once so careful to remain silent, began to speak more openly, sharing their knowledge of the family's darkest secrets. The president's actions, which had been concealed for so long, were now becoming public knowledge. The truth, once buried in the deepest recesses of the estate, was now inescapable. No one could avoid it any longer. The once grand estate, a symbol of the president's power and influence, had now become a place of reckoning. The family, once so united in their silence, was now torn apart by the very truth they had tried so desperately to suppress. The president's reputation, once untouchable, was now in ruins, and his legacy was nothing more than a shattered reflection of the lies he had built his life upon. His wife, whose life had been defined by the pursuit of perfection, was now left to confront the reality of her own choices. And the children, those 6 lives who had been forced to live in the shadows, were no longer willing to remain hidden. The storm that had been gathering for so long was finally breaking, and no one within the estate was untouched. The truth had come for them all, and now they had to face the consequences of their actions. The mansion, once a place of power and control, had become a tomb of secrets, and the time had come for the family to reckon with the cost of the lives they had destroyed. The truth, once so carefully hidden, was now impossible to ignore. And as the family stood at the edge of their own destruction, they could only wonder, would they ever be able to rebuild, or would the weight of their sins crush them all?